Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Boldman, and in my regular position, I'm a District Fire Management Officer on the Boise National Forest on the Idaho City Ranger District. And today I'm going to be talking about my experience with pods while working as a strategic operational planner on the Dixie fire in California. So let me pull up my PowerPoint. To start out, I thought I would put my assignment to the Dixie fire into context. The Dixie fire started on July 13th, and I was mobilized with Great Basin Team 1, and we arrived at the incident command post for the east zone of the Dixie fire in Quincy, California on August 27th. So the fire had already been burning 6 weeks when I arrived. And when we got there, the fire was already more than 765,000 acres. And there had been several incident management teams who had been managing the fire at that point. During the 2 weeks I was there as a strategic operational planner, I worked to help keep the WFDS decision up to date. So on the left side of the screen now, you can see the fire progression map showing how the fire had progressed up to that point, with the most recent growth in the east zone being in the southeast part of the fire. And then on the right is a screen capture from WFDS showing the planning area and perimeter when I arrived. Before I got there, a lot of people had been working in WFDS and on the long-term or strategic planning. You can see some of the names there listed on the bottom right side of the screen, and I'm sure there were lots of other people involved whose names aren't included there. And I understand, just like Cody was saying, there was a lot of people behind the scenes involved before I arrived and after I left. And so the reason I wanted to point this out is that for this presentation today, I'm just going to be focused on some of the highlights that took place from my perspective during my assignment to the incident. So on the screen now, you can see the perimeter from August 27th, symbolized by the blue polygon, and the pink polygons underneath represent the most recent fire perimeters from this year. And I wanted to point out that you can see the final perimeter for the Dixie fire to give you an idea where the fire grew to eventually. And I also wanted to point out the perimeter from the sugar fire there to the east over here. It was a fire from earlier this year that was no longer growing, but it was still not in contained status. And that's going to come into play later during this presentation. But obviously that sugar fire scar is a barrier to fire spread there to the east. And then for this presentation today, I uploaded the daily fire perimeters from the FTP site to the RMA dashboard. And I'm going to be toggling through those to help explain how the fire progressed during my assignment. The other thing I wanted to point out that you might recognize from what Rick was showing earlier is that the pod's boundaries were already preloaded into the RMA dashboard. And these blue lines on the screen now represent those pod boundaries for the Plumas National Forest. So this is the main view I'm going to be using with the RMA dashboard at this current extent, focusing on the most active part of the east zone during my assignment. Okay, so I'm going to start stepping forward through the days to show you how the perimeter increased over time. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, the perimeter for August 29th is active now. The blue shape is on the map. Here's the perimeter from August 30th. And then here's the perimeter from August 31st. And the fire weather forecast that day included a red flag warning for low humidity and gusty wind. The forecast called for ridgetop winds gusting to 22 miles from the west and southwest. So with the red flag warning, there was, and the winds predicted, there were requests for fire models from long-term analysts. So one thing I wanted to mention that I thought went well on this assignment from my point of view was that ongoing daily call, recurring daily call that was set up by the strategic operational planner who was on the incident before me. It was really helpful. And I've experienced this before on other large fires with multiple incident management teams assigned. It's really helpful to have a call like that where the fire behavior analysts and the long-term analysts can get together and coordinate fire behavior modeling requests and any input that might be relevant for keeping the WFDS decision up to date. So it's helpful to have the strategic operations planner on there. Oftentimes agency administrators get on there as well as fire management staff from the local units. So really something I wanted to put forward to the group, having those daily strategic planning check-in meetings really useful. So on this slide, you can see the modeling outputs for the 2-day near-term fire behavior run that was run that day. And, this particular one modeled the fire growth over 2 days and two nights with those predicted winds so that we could see where the fire was likely to spread. So There in Quincy, this on the screen now is the view I had of the column from the incident command post there in Quincy at the Plumas County Fairgrounds. And those southwest winds that were predicted materialized, and then the fire made an 8-mile run to the northeast. So this slide shows the perimeter after that run took place, and we can see the large run it made to the northeast, driven by the winds out of the west and southwest. And as the fire made this run to the northeast, it burned past some management action points. So I set up a meeting with some of the fire and fuels folks from the Plumas National Forest to get input from folks with local knowledge, so that we could, identify new management action points and take a look at the planning area to see if we need to expand that. So to prepare for my meeting with the local folks, I got the shape files for the pods boundaries from one of the local fire planners, and had the team GIS specialist make this map showing the pods in relation to the current fire perimeter. So it'd be available for us to refer to as we identified new management action points for the strategic operations plan and also for the WFDS decision. I also had maps printed showing the suppression difficulty index and potential control locations that included the current fire perimeter and the current management action points. And I was able to do this in ArcMap, and one of the local fire planners had made a map in ArcMap and gave me access to the file. So I was able to update these maps just by adding data from ArcGIS Online for the SDI and PCL raster data. And that made it relatively easy for me to keep these images updated for uploading the images into products like the long-term strategic plan and the WFDS decision. And then I printed hard copies of these maps so I could have them for the meeting with those local fire and fuel specialists from the forest to get their input on where it might make the most sense for creating new management action points. Those maps were really useful in the pod's boundaries in relation to the fire perimeter was really useful also. We also had maps showing the outputs from the fire modeling runs, the WFDS FS Pro and near-term fire behavior runs, to help give us an idea where the fire was likely to go. So on this slide, I wanted to draw your attention to some of the relevant natural barriers and pod boundaries. So starting to the north, where the fire was going to be spreading, there was a highway 395 there to the north, which was a good barrier that was already there. And also there was a step down from an escarpment right there, and a change in fuel type, changing from timber up on top of the escarpment down to sage at the base of the escarpment. And so we knew by consulting with the local fire managers that operations would most likely be able to stop the progression to the northeast on the flats north of the highway. So that was something that we took into consideration. And then over here on the eastern edge, where the fire was looking like it was going to be heading, is that sugar fire that I had. There were obvious natural barriers between the fire and values at risk to the north and to the east. So creating maps to the north and east was pretty straightforward. But the fire still did have potential to spread towards values to the south. And so we used the maps of the pod boundaries to give us an idea of places to focus on. So we looked at some of these pod boundaries and wanted to take a closer look there. And the local folks had mentioned this pod boundary there in Dada Canyon. So during this time, I got an email from Rick Stratton asking if I was seeing this opportunity to contain the fire on the southeast by tying the Dixie fire into the sugar fire along this potential control location area. It's good potential control location kind of shown in green there, and then that pod boundary shown in blue. And in about 5 minutes, I was able to learn how to create this map that's on the screen now that shows this good opportunity to potentially contain the fire within that area. And Rick also showed me how to create a shape in the RMA dashboard using the map viewer feature to create that yellow line to draw attention to that area. So I think this is a pretty good example of how the pods can be used to inform operational scale prioritization of work and to then reduce exposure to the highly valued resources and assets. The other thing I wanted to point out on here is we use the housing density clusters as well for reference to get an idea where there were clusters of houses. So one thing I really like about the RMA dashboard is that a lot of the layers are already preloaded for each geographic area, so you don't need super strong GIS skills to be able to use it. And you can easily create PDFs of maps of whatever extent you're interested in by using the print map feature. So on the screen now is a map I made using that print map feature in the RMA dashboard. And then on this map, I have the topo layer on instead of the PCL layer to share with the operations folks so they could ground truth that potential location. And emailing this map allowed me to quickly share this information with the incident commander and the planning operations section chief to help inform and validate location of control lines and help them position suppression resources. And when the IC replied to my email, he wrote, keep feeding us intel and analytics, it's helping. And so this was an eye-opening learning experience for me. I was lucky enough to be assigned to the fire as a SOPL at this time. And just like Cody was mentioning during his presentation, a lot of times showing people this information is the easiest way to communicate it. So we had the maps from the previous slides to refer to, and I gave the local fire managers from the Plumas National Forest different colored Sharpie markers, and they drew new management action points and increased the planning area. Then I referred to that map with the new MAPs and planning area that were drawn in with the Sharpie markers to digitize those lines and create those shapes and WFDS that you're seeing on the screen now. And we were able to get these updated management action points and planning area incorporated into the WFDS decision to keep it current. Then also on this slide are the names of some of the people who were helping to provide information about fire behavior and fire models during this time. And again, there was many other people who were involved too. I just wanted to be transparent and make it clear there was definitely a group effort. Once I had the shapes created in WFDS, I was able to download them and then upload those shape files for the management action points and perimeter into ArcGIS to update this map to include into the strategic operations plan and WFDS decision. On the screen now is a management action point template that I inherited from the SOPL who was there before me, Dan Osman from the National Park Service. It was super useful to have those templates available. They were blank, blank copies of this template. It was useful to have several blank versions available to me when I sat down with the local fire and fuels folks from the Plumas, so they could help me fill in the info for all the different categories there, values at risk, cooperators that we need to be working with, suggested actions, and then the other relevant info for each of the management action points that we developed. I just want to advance through a few more days of updated perimeters to show you how things played out during the remainder of my assignment. Turns out that near-term fire behavior modeling output had been pretty good, and this perimeter on the screen now looks very similar to the NTFB outputs that had been modeled a couple days earlier. And suppression resources, thanks to coordinating with operations, were concentrated on the northern edge of the fire there along that highway, and then on that Dada Canyon on the south end. And the suppression operations were successful in preventing the fire from growing to the north and the south, and it just continued to fill in the unburned area between the Dixie fire and that sugar fire there to the east. And one thing I wanted to mention also is that on September 4th, the eastern edge of the Dixie fire burned up to the western edge of that sugar fire. And that was kind of an interesting situation too. After considering the different alternatives, the decision was made to separately manage these two active wildfires that had burned together. The reason is because a clear line of demarcation could be drawn between the two fires. And the sugar fire had established control lines around the perimeter, and there had been no growth on the sugar fire in several weeks. And so management could be certain where one fire started and the other fire began. A lot of times fires are merged in WFDS when they meet like this, but we knew the Dixie fire might end up being a cost recovery fire with ongoing litigation. So in this case, it made sense to keep the records separate for the Dixie and the sugar fires and manage them as separate incidents. You can see here the fire never made it past that pod boundary in Dada Canyon. And this slide shows the management action points and the planning area in WFDS at the end of my assignment. And then here's my last slide. And so this is may seem different than the previous slides. Just by coincidence, as chance would have it, I returned to the Dixie fire for another assignment on September 22nd. I was a division supervisor on the East Zone, and we were responding to smoke reports from the public and also working with resource advisors to target priority areas for suppression repair. And the Plumas National Forest was incorporating POD's boundaries into their suppression repair planning. So this purple line here you can see was one of the pod's boundaries. Here, I'll toggle back a couple slides. That was a pod's boundary that you can't see because it's covered up by the fire perimeter, but right there, that edge of the fire was along a pod's boundary. And so they have it identified here as a pod boundary. And, they were taking different suppression repair actions on chunks of line that were pod's boundary. And that I think is pretty interesting. I think it makes me think there's potential for utilizing the RMA dashboards and pod boundaries for suppression repair planning and for strategic planning of future fuels treatment projects. And to my knowledge, the most recent version of the infrastructure bill still includes language about establishing a categorical exclusion for creating fuel breaks of up to 1,000 feet in width in the WUI or in public drinking water source areas. And if this language stays in the final version of the bill and it passes, there may be opportunities to pre-treat pods boundaries moving forward. All right, so I know we're up against a time limit, and that's the end of my presentation, so I'll turn it back over to Jane.